Alright, first thing, we turn on the radio. Second thing, we turn off because copyright. Now, it's injectors. Now that the injectors are all cleaned up, thanks to the wire wheel and a little bit of brake clean and so forth, let's turn on some light. The next thing we'll be doing is getting that 12mm bolt loosened, as well as that one. We don't want to forget the spacer that is just below the bolt and on the other side, as well as there's a base washer right above my finger there. Once we get those two removed, the whole fuel rail lifts off and we'll be able to pull our injectors out. Now that we've loosened both bolts, I can move the injector rail around so everything can be pulled out for the washer above and below. But before we do that, we want to pull this plug loose, since it's actually the wiring harness for the injectors. After pressing down this tab, we were able to disconnect the plug here. So the next step will be loosening this actual clamp for the fuel input, and that is our fuel return line. We'll both loosen these and disconnect them and put them over here. That way they're out of the way for us to pull the rail out this way. Alright? I ended up picking up the fuel rail, now that's loose, and we were able to get the little spacer that goes between the fuel rail and the intake that it bolts to. Get the other side's little spacer and such undone, and we should be able to start shuffling the fuel rail out. Anyways, let's start to shuffle this over. And we'll cut, because I can't really do this with one hand. Now that we've moved the fuel rail over some, we actually have enough room to actually break the back return fuel line loose. With that, I put bolts in both of them, just so I'm trying to not have fumes and lose any fuel if they do fall over and so forth. But a clever little thing to do is, if you have a spare piece of fuel line, loop the intake to the return. That way you're not losing extra fuel out of the fuel rail to go all over the place. Trying to keep things cleaner. Anyways, we'll return back to shuffling this all out. Alright, so the fuel rail is out, and it is my fault that I forgot there was a ground wire that is also part of that wire or fuel injector harness, so it has to live inside of there because that ground is buried way back down below the intake. So it's not that hard to trace which plug goes to which injector. And we're just going to clean this up and go from there. Thing to note is, if you need to replace your O-ring seals for your injectors, is to use these right here. Oops, sorry. There we go. Alright, hope that helps in case you have a broken O-ring seal. Now that our fuel rail is scrubbed down and cleaned up from all the varnish and so forth, we're going to lubricate the O-rings here so that they don't have any binding and just fit snugly into that. For what I'm going to do is, you can use grease that's high temp, or you can just use a little bit of ATF and it'll be fine on these seals and not damage them. Alright, I didn't have the time or a way to film it while doing it to show that I had the injectors set in place, and then finagled the fuel rail in, and then snapped it down. Now the next thing we have to do is actually pick it back up now that the injectors are captured by the fuel rail, and set in our washer that basically goes in between the gap of it and the intake. But before then, we're going to clean up these bolts. A few coats of high temp paint over it. We'll let those dry there. And now back to putting everything together here. We've got the washer set between the intake and the fuel rail again. And we've done the same over here, which we probably can't get a good shot of. I've plugged the main harness back in for the fuel rail, and I put the input line of our fuel system back on. I'm probably going to put the return line on back here and start to put the vacuum lines back together and do that one at a time and show you how. And then plug in the injectors, tighten the bolts down, and we'll start this and see how it runs. Alright, that is the last vacuum line, other than I would like to put this one back where it was. There we go. Now the last thing we have to do is plug in the outer injectors. I already got through the hassle of plugging in the inner two. And a big help is just take some scissors or anything you can cut, and there's an extra prong that does absolutely nothing but get in your way of plugging it in back here. It does nothing except be a nuisance. So you can cut that off and get a little more room to plug that into there. And we're going to do this one next where it fell down into there. We can pull it out and get everything plugged in. One thing to consider while you're getting these plugged in is you want to push down until you hear a click. Just like that. And now you know it's seated onto the injector. And now that we've actually got it plugged in, I can finagle it since the fuel rail is loose and get it pushed back over to where it's in line with the other injectors plugged in. Just like that. Alright, now we've got every injector plugged in and routed. Now we just have to snug the bolts back down here and here, and we should be able to start it. There we go. And that's how you change a set of injectors on a P6D and a Festiva.